Desmond is the non-executive director of the Urban Renewal Authority in Hong Kong. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Desmond, and he's going to tell us about their people-first approach. Desmond.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I won't be too long to hold up your time for lunch, but thank you very much, John, and thank you for inviting me to share what's happening in Hong Kong with you. Now, Jenny, in her opening speech yesterday, advocated a heritage approach of the people, for the people, and by the people. Incidentally, this is also a vision shared in Hong Kong in terms of our urban renewal and heritage conservation strategy. And I'm being asked actually to talk about this approach, how it came about, and what has been done, and what lessons it brings this morning. As someone involved in heritage conservation and urban renewal for the last 2 decades, I must say that the government in Hong Kong only got serious about heritage conservation recently. And the milestone of change actually came in 2007, when the current Chief Secretary for Administration, Mrs. Carrie Lam, became the Secretary for Development. And as head of a new policy bureau, she totally revamped the whole government machinery for urban development and conservation, and launched a series of new initiatives that aim to engage the public and NGO sectors in the collaboration to conserve government-owned historic buildings. So what led to the approach called People's First and Public Participation was in fact the result of a 2-year review of our urban renewal strategy with extensive public consultation, and is in fact a government strategy for urban renewal to be implemented, not just from the organization I come from, the URA, and the relevant government departments and other stakeholders. So the URS applies also to conservation. And conservation is carried out not just by the URA, but by other government and public agencies. And all this actually is under the purview of the Development Bureau. So this actually is a chart showing where we are. In fact, we are a statutory organization with non-executive directors and also, government representatives overlooking, this issue on urban renewal. And in fact, there's also a new Commissioner for Heritage Office set up, since 2007 in the whole spectrum of works that relates to development of the city, conservation and heritage. So what does it mean? It is a policy that aims actually to reduce inadequately housed people and improve the quality of life of residents in urban areas, in balancing the interests and needs of all sectors of the community without sacrificing the lawful rights of a particular group. And also is a community consensus on conservation as part of the forward-looking vision of sustainable development and quality city building. And that means actually 7 items. First, appropriate development density. Second, land use planning. Third, urban design. Fourth, greening. Fifth, local culture. Fifth, heritage preservation. And also, the last issue on the harbor, because harbor actually is also our heritage asset, for the city. So how do we implement it? We look at, development needs in the public interest, with respect for private property rights, with budgetary considerations, cross-sector collaboration, and active engagement of stakeholders and the general public. Now, I want to talk about, this particular initiative because I think it has something which I find interestingly similar to what the HLF actually has also recently launched, called the Heritage Enterprise Fund. The Revitalizing Historic Buildings Through Partnership Scheme, which is also called the Revitalization Scheme, in fact, it aims at giving out, government-owned buildings to the non-profit making organizations, inviting them to make proposals on how to preserve and revitalize the buildings into innovative use. And there is an advisory committee set up to look after this selection procedure with government funding of about $2 billion, which is something like 200 million pounds, earmarked for the renovation works. It not only look after the hardware conversion, but also give out the starting cost for operating of the social enterprise for the use of the buildings with technical support. And so far, since its launch in 2011, we have 6 projects completed, but in fact, there are many more in the pipeline. And I would like to show you some of the completed projects, like this particular Grade 2 buildings of a magistracy, now given over to an American College of Art and Design to turn it into a school. And in fact, the conversion was so successful that it earned the UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage Award. Another building, which I'm also involved as I'm also sitting on the board of the Youth Hostel Association, is to convert, a public housing blocks into a youth hostel. And in fact, this project has won positive support from the community, because we are not just preserving, the hardware of the building, but also we are also calling the old residents of the housing project to form part of the community. And in fact, some of them actually are willing to be docent for a museum, which we set up within the building about the history of public housing in Hong Kong. And then this one, actually called the Blue House, is a conservation effort not only about buildings but also the people. And we try to, in fact, allow the regional residents living in this building to stay on. And then these are some of the other projects that are on the pipeline. And in fact, I think in the next few years you will see each one of them actually being completed. For example, this particular Chinese-style mansion is going to be turned into a music school. So back to what I'm doing within the Urban Renewal Authority, we also make reference to the government policy on heritage conservation. But in fact, we are more flexible in the way that we could look for collaborative partnership with non-making profit organizations. And also, we try to make public access to the projects that we aim to revitalize. And I'll show you also some of the projects under this policy. One is a Western market, which is under our purview to convert it and change it into a right now, actually for some years, place for the cloth trade, which actually had been on in the neighborhood for some years. The second one, also completed, is recently, actually last year, was a series of shop house, which we turned into a comics home base, for promoting, the animation industry. So you can see, that was actually how the building looks like originally. And then we try to retain some of the fabrics and then convert the buildings actually with recent modern construction, but keeping, the interior as much original as possible. So this is actually how it now looks, and is now a base for the animation industry and comic industry. And the last project I want to show you, which is in the pipeline, and in fact it is now being held up because of a judicial review on how the building should be preserved and conserved, is a central market in the central business district of Hong Kong, which the government actually has boldly allowed it to stay, instead of selling it and get tens and billions of land income. And this actually would be converted into a building with community uses, and for people actually working in Central to come and have the lunch. And you can see that actually this is how the building actually looks right now. And we cover it up with all these hoarding using the artists, and these are the images of how the building will look when it's completed. And in fact, now the controversy with the judicial review is actually this top portion, whether this should be allowed to be built on top of a historic building, and despite the fact that this actually is a collaborated design by a very famous Japanese architect, Arata Isozaki. I think there is some voice actually in the community that buildings should be kept as original as possible. So what are the lessons? With the projects that I've shown you, perhaps I could summarize the 4 points. One is a better use and maintenance of vacant historic buildings for the community. Second is collaboration of the private and NGO sectors in conservation and revitalization. Third is conservation of buildings as well as social network and collective memory. And finally is the idea that this heritage conservation could also be promoting cultural activities and creative industries for the city. Now, my last word before I leave the platform is when I was listening to the other cities like Manchester, Bristol, and Glasgow, how actually Hong Kong could compare with them. I want to leave you with this two news which I read in the morning, this morning. And the first piece of news actually came from Hong Kong when I read that, two leaders of the democracy parties actually met the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, recently. And it sparkled off, a lot of protests and criticism from the opposition. And then I found out that there is a cabinet reshuffle. I don't know whether there's anything to do, with the connection between the two, and I hope not. But the illustration of this point perhaps is a hint for me that British legacy as part of our heritage in Hong Kong certainly would continue to have a role to play in the shaping and developing of the city in future. Thank you.
Stay there. Desmond, there was a couple of things I just wanted to pick up quickly. There was a question from the floor at the end of the last panel session, which we didn't actually pick up on, which was the difference between information and genuine consultation, I think was the spirit around this question of who shapes place. I was struck, therefore, that when you talked about this people-first approach, you had a 2-year consultation period. So I was just wondering how open that was. Were you engaging with their sense of pride in place, their view of assets, tangible and intangible culture? What was the character of that conversation you had with the Hong Kong public? And what did they tell you? What were the messages that they brought back to you that shaped what you've just presented to us? What stood out from that consultation? Right.
In fact, is a series of workshops, with questionnaires and also, the design roundtables that people were invited to participate. And then, of course, it was, in fact, the review was mostly on urban renewal. And one of the a few issues actually came out from this consultation was this idea of the people first public participation, and that very often in the past urban renewal is a top-down process. We have the authority. In fact, before that there was a land corporation company that comes into a neighborhood and revitalize or redevelop the community without proper consultation. And after this review, I think we are now actually taking not just this active approach from the authority to design where to regenerate, but also asking the community to come back and suggest where they would like their neighborhood to be regenerated. And this is actually a big difference. Mm. Yeah.
My other quick question, Hong Kong's always been a place where that kind of clash of modernity and tradition is particularly striking. And when you were running through that outcome slide about what this produced, you talked about preserving social network and collective memory, which obviously has a very strong echo to what Maria said this morning around the memories around Bellevue in Manchester. So I was just wondering, how is that? How are you carrying forward that aspiration, and how has that manifested itself in practical terms around what you've done? Because I think that's a very arresting phrase, both social network and collective memory. So what does it mean in practice?
Well, the example I was mentioning was this youth hostel project, from the public housing project before. In fact, in revitalizing that, we did a lot of engagement with previous residents in the community. And we asked them actually to share with us, their memories of the place. And many of them actually, including, you might be amazed to find out actually who are the people who used to live there. There's this very famous film director, John Woo, who was also a resident of this community in the public housing. And then he came out and shared his stories of struggling, coming to Hong Kong and then, staying out in these squatters and then being rehoused in these public housing blocks. And despite all this, he made his way, to success, in the film industry. And there were also, other success stories and people's memories of living in that community. And we all capture all that actually within, a museum. We also established, within the project. So it's not just a project for youth hostelers, but also, a museum showcasing, all these life and stories of people who used to be there. So in a way, this is a project not just preserving the fabric, but also preserving the network and the memories of people who used to be the users.
Desmond, thank you very much. I'm stealing from our lunch, so I don't have time, unfortunately, to go to all of you. I'm sure some of you will have questions for Desmond. Desmond will be here over lunch. Please engage with them. We thought it important to drop in some of these international perspectives in a crowded programme. And Desmond, thank you so much for your time and for that insight into what you've done in Hong Kong. So if we give Char appreciation, thank you very much. Thank you, Desmond.